Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this Google Hangout. We're delighted to have you with us. Many of you have been following us in the discussion forums, we've been looking at the lectures, and we're really glad to have two exciting people with us online today to answer your questions live, and some which will come through the platform in the discussion session. So let's dive into it. We have here Professor Peter Haugan from the University of Bergen in Norway, who's currently, I believe, in Paris for a meeting of an organization he chairs, which is the Intergovernmental, now look, I had this all, Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of the UNESCO. And Martin Visbeck, a professor of physical oceanography, who's also very involved, among other things, in the SDSN and the SDG Academy, which is organizing this course. So I know that both of you have had the privilege and the pleasure of being at the New York Ocean Conference last week, or week before last now. And I'm sure we'd like to hear a little bit more about what you heard. But maybe, Peter, you'd like to start by telling us a little bit about the IOC and what your activities have been and will be there.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on here. Now, I'm an oceanographer, and I spent a number of years in oceanography before I even heard about the IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and I think many oceanographers have it the same way. But I came into it some years ago as an expert in a committee that is set up, and then later I became involved in actually the running of this organization. So, as the name says, it's an intergovernmental organization. That means that it's not individual scientists or people who are members here, it's member states, nations. So we have 148 member states now, and they come together to discuss ocean science, but also services made from ocean observations. Tsunami warning systems are set up by this organization. Sharing of data and information and capacity development is actually among the things that this organization tries to develop standards, develops best practices, and then take initiatives to join forces among member states for oceanographic related activities.
Martin, I know that you've been tweeting a lot and telling us about the exciting things that happened at the Ocean Conference, which you were both at. What would you say were your highlights? Because that was really a turning point, I think, for bringing the ocean into global public awareness.
So the first thing I was proud of, I got this T-shirt which says SDG 14, Life Below the Water, and I got it on the day before the conference started, where there was a so-called side event that was an awareness-raising activity from the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, a program that is interested in human development, supporting the nations who are trying to catch up with maybe the countries like Norway or Germany, the United States or France. And we were all giving this T-shirt, which I thought was great. And we also got the chance to travel a bit on the Hudson River, and there was an awareness-raising program for the New York citizens, a festival of ocean on Governor's Islands. But really, the whole thrust of the conference was to do two things. First, it was the first ever ocean conference at the United Nations. And I think that's a bit of history that we all together were making. And it was surely a consequence of the process by which the Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called 2030 Agenda for Development, was started with. 5 years ago, when a number of actors, member states, were thinking about what the right mix of these goals should be, there was a discussion whether the ocean might have its own goal. And I can say that my country, Germany, the US was mixed about it, France wasn't so sure. We were going for 10 goals, and 10 goals meant no special goal for ocean. But I think as the negotiations developed, the small island development countries, that is countries like Tuvalu, Fiji, and maybe Mauritius, they really sort of ganged up in some ways and got together and said, well, we really need a goal for ocean, because multilateral processes at the UN, ocean is kind of forgotten. These are legal people, these are policy people, they have a lot to do on their hands, and they tend to forget that there's a big ocean out there. Although they know that it covers 71% of the planet, They might not even know that half of the oxygen that we breathe comes from the ocean. So very much it was an awareness-raising conference to really bring back why the ocean is so important for humanity. Now, why was New York important in general? I will answer it in two ways. If you look at the legal text, the outcome of a document, because these conferences are not events for civil society or scientists or ocean activists to get together, these are actually meeting of the diplomats to agree on some legal text. And the outcome declaration of 2 weeks ago, UN Ocean Conference, some diplomats say is weak law. Decided that went beyond of what we had in other agreements before. So on the one hand, you can say on strict legal terms, maybe there wasn't much there. But I think that's not the most important reason why we had the conference. What it really did do, it bring home to the UN that the ocean is important for all of the multilateral agreements that the UN is engaged with. And I saw in the hallways diplomats who were going to the Security Council, negotiating peace processes, and said, oh yeah, there's an ocean. This week, there's 4,000 people coming to our place and talking to us about the ocean. There were 5 days of negotiation in the General Assembly Hall. So there was a lot of that process because we came as scientists, many came as civil society, others came as business leaders to really share our concern for change in the ocean, but also to talk to each other about possibilities, how by working together, highlighting, we come up with better solutions to promote sustainable development and a better, as I say, human-ocean interaction. So for me, it was an exciting week. I think it was a great success to see so many people part in discussions, and I really think we met sustainable development and a better, as I say, human-ocean interaction. So for me, it was an exciting week. I think it was a great success to see so many people. Avan, back to you now. Okay, Avan had a bit of problem with. From your perspective, what you found was exciting in New York?
Well, I think this was also a great success, and in some ways I think it has some similarities with the Paris climate meeting, which has been spoken so much about. If you look at that declaration which came out of that, it was also not very binding in terms of legal obligations, but it set the focus on the issues and also a desire and need to report on the progress. So I think just the fact that governments come together at high level and decide on a call for action, which happened in New York, and also this other part, formal outcome of the conference, the so-called voluntary commitments, which come some from governments and some from civil society and other organizations to say, hey, this is what I or we promise to contribute to this process, and it will be followed up, it will be monitored. There will be another conference in 3 years, but there will also be other ways of monitoring the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030. And I must also say that for me, who represent an organization who is not that well known, neither as good as it should be, perhaps in the high level of society or even in the active parts, to come there and to have people say, hey, your organization has this mandate. We can actually use this organization as a mechanism for providing some of the science and some of the data and information and exchange this as a basis for the policy decisions that have to be made. There are difficult, political decisions that have to be made when it comes to sharing resources from the ocean and many other decisions that cannot be made on such a conference. But the fact that the sense was so much in favor of using science as a basis for these future deliberation was, to me, a very important take-home message. And I came very inspired out of that and say, all of us who are involved in science, we really have a marching order now to try and provide what the policy needs, and we have some topics that need to be addressed in the future.
Peter, the IOC has started off on a decade of ocean sciences. And I have looked a bit at the website, the link of which was posted. And could you tell us a bit more about this? What do you think ocean science really will contribute to what you've actually spoke about is very much a political and a developmental goal.
Yes, we have started to discuss first inside the IOC with the member states the idea of having a more of a concerted action from science towards the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And I would like to say not only Sustainable Development Goal 14, because if you look at it, there are other goals: climate, food, energy. Many things depend on the ocean, and some have even started to look at how these goals interact and can reinforce, or perhaps the other way. We say that what is the science that is needed to underpin policy for 2030, and what needs to be done to achieve what we say the ocean we need for the future we want. We need a well-functioning ocean. We need an ocean that delivers ecosystem services, that is relevant to climate, that provides fisheries which is sustainable, that can maybe even give us some of the new resources, not only the mineral resources on the seafloor, but also genetic resources. We need to have ways in which we can combine all of these different objectives in a rational way. So what we have done now is that we have launched this initiative and asked others to be involved in co-designing a program that would last from 2021 to 2030, a decade. And we have approached other UN organizations, and we get a lot of positive feedback from a number of organizations. Yes, they say that we want to be involved in co-designing this. And also outside the UN, global organizations and also regional organizations. We need to map the seafloor to a certain extent. What are the realistic goals that can be achieved by 2030? Who can be involved? Who is willing to contribute here? We need to understand more of the ocean ecosystem, large scale. Who can be involved? Who can contribute? We need to underpin the various policy goals. So this is the beginning of a process, and I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from a number of players saying that this is the right time to do this. We need free and independent ocean research, but we need also to align the priorities for the research towards the policy goals. And this is the phase that we are entering into now, which I think is very interesting and very, very, very rewarding to sort of flesh out the program that would be what we require to be where we want to be in 2030.
So I know that co-design implies that the design of a scientific question would be in collaboration with stakeholders from various sectors, if you want. Could you expand on this a bit? I know, Martin, that you're involved in such projects as well. Maybe with an example that has functioned particularly well, or one that you think is particularly important. Martin, would you like to go?
Oh, I go, good. Yes, Avan, excellent question. I think, and I'm a big fan of this Decade for Ocean Science for two reasons. There can be a little bit of an inflation of years of something or other, or decades of science of something or other, but I think this particular one comes at a very timely point in history. Given that we just had the ocean conference, given that the next conference of parties for the climate negotiations will be around ocean, given that most political leaders around the globe show an interest in ocean, and there are some ways to agree on ocean issues, while there are in many other arenas of multilateral points, there's is maybe not the greatest of times to get to agreements. But on ocean, there's clearly a consensus emerging that we need better science, we need better observations, and we need better engagement between the partners. But let me give you an example where I think co-design of research has worked very well. And I'm going to give you one example from a very exotic arena, which has to do with fisheries. Fisheries is not exotic, but that particular maybe is. So in fisheries, it's a very complex system about the ocean. Overall, there's way too much fishery happening in the globe and in the coastal arenas. There's a lot of illegal fishing happening also in regions of the ocean which are designated as no-take zones, but quite often small island development countries are not able to look at these. So a nice idea of a co-designed project was when some of the NGOs who were trying to fight illegal fishing, some of the small island development states government said, well, we wish we could do something about it. We don't have patrol boats. We don't have means to enforce the law. But then Google came in and some experts from deep learning from the Google group, and they basically said, oh, we have an idea. We're going to get access to all the vessel tracking data. So these are data that all vessels, commercial vessels that run around on the ocean, are transmitting in real time in many ways to avoid collision. But from these tracks, by using deep learning algorithms, you can actually tell whether a fishing boat is going from A to B, it's transiting, or whether it's sort of doing circles, and then it's probably fishing. So they diagnosed all of these behaviors, a 15-year-long data set, and it's now available online. And it allows you to look at where fishing is happening. And it's very interesting to see that in some regions where it's illegal, no fishermen fish. In the Pacific, that's around American Samoa because they have patrol boats. And then in some other area around small island states where the fishermen know they don't have patrol boats, they're just fishing just as much as if there was no protected area. But now we can use that information and that data to actually for enforcement issues. And I've heard about one case from a small country in Ecuador where they indeed used that information and called the fishing vessel and said, you are illegally fishing in a no-take zone. And the fisherman said, no, I'm not. I'm just transiting. And they said, well, we looked at your track, you're not transiting, you're doing certain motion. And then the captain of that vessel within 10 minutes changed the negotiations, said, okay, let's go to settlement, I'm willing to pay the fine. And I think it just shows you when you co-design research, when you talk to decision makers, bring academic learning and some new technology to the fore, you are probably just at the verge of really getting into a new age of controlling illegal fishing. And solutions like that is what co-design of research means. You're really looking for innovative methods that allow you to break through a long-standing problem by new ideas. And I think that was one of the ambitions that we can discuss many more of in this exciting new decade for ocean science, and some of the programs that I can discuss later are trying to do that more formally.
Okay, so thank you, Martin. I'm looking into our viewers. It's very exciting. We have people from South Africa, Germany, France, Mexico, Tanzania, the UK, and the US, Ecuador, Costa Rica. I could keep going, but this is really very exciting. So let's dive into a question. Let me take the easiest question first. Thomas Chardon says, cool shirt, and Fabi Galvan would like one. But we can't answer that right now. So let's take a direct question that comes in from Eugene in South Africa. He says, hi, Peter. I'm wondering what the smaller and or less developed countries' contribution was at the summit. Was their voice heard in terms of rural community development and sustainability?
Well, you know, the good thing with the UN system is that every nation has one vote, whether it's a large or a small country. And I think in particular for the ocean, both the development of the Sustainable Development Goal 14, which Martin touched upon, and also in the discussions here, small nations like Palau and others were very, very strongly present there. And that goes also for the development in New York just a week ago. We had a side event on this decade where we had Samoa and the Maldives together with Norway promoting the initiative. So I think that everybody comes there on an equal footing, doesn't depend on whether you're a small or a large country. Of course, the issue with some of the small states and the small communities is that they can't go to every meeting. They don't have people to represent them everywhere. So they have to form alliances and go together. But I think that is happening now. And I think also we can see when it comes to the capacity development and the training and so forth, that also as linkages get better, you can get people together. In the Pacific, there is a university spread out in 12 countries, a regional university. We have a similar one in the Caribbean. So technology is now breaking away some of the limitations for having the voices heard. And I think that was very promising in New York as well.
If I may add to that one, I was very impressed. First of all, we should remember who organized that conference. It was the government of Sweden and Fiji. And in the beginning, the idea was to actually hold the conference in Fiji, but for a number of different reasons, when the interest of the ocean became large, the folks from Fiji said, "Whoa, I'm not sure we can actually organize a conference of that scale so easily in Fiji." And so then the discussion was, where should the conference be held? And I think the decision was made that maybe having it at New York, close to the UN headquarters, was a sensible thing to do. But having said that, I mean, the Fiji folks and the nation was deeply engaged in the conference, in the preparation of it and during the conference. For example, they brought some of the local artists to the conference. The opening of the conference was done with a traditional dance, and everybody got the blessing from the gods for a good outcome and good spirits. The Fiji people organized quite a few side events promoting the Pacific Island states and their coalitions. We heard a lot about activities on the ground. For example, Fiji announced that they're going to ban plastic bags, I believe this or next year. We heard great announcements from Palau about new protected areas, actually no-take zones. It was another island in the Pacific that announced it at the conference. And I think there was an understanding that, yes, OECD countries have a lot of responsibility for some of the downturn of ocean affairs, ocean health, ocean status. But on the solution space, we saw a lot of engagement, and in particular opportunities for rural communities, because they are the ones who feel the pressure the most, but they're also the ones who've been innovating about their own areas. They were thinking of, how can we as a small community engage in more sustainable fishing? How can we as a small community think about our waste, that not the waste goes unfiltered into the ocean? And what can we do by, as Peter said, engaging in these global mechanisms in a sort of shared mode, shared between other island states in the region. So I think there was a big discussion about local community. There was a lot of discussion about regional engagement, and because people feel it's on the regional level that much of the implementation of the transformative behavior change will happen. And I was very, very pleased to see a big presence of the communities from the small island development countries in New York. And I think it was very clear when you ran a side event, and I ran 3, everybody was scrounging for getting some experts from the region, because it was really they are affected the most, and collectively we have to change the way we deal with the ocean.
Well, this leads straight into a question that Fabi Galvan has placed, which is to go from the global to the regional. She says, in regional terms, how feasible would it be to raise the possibility of setting up forums or summits to address the issues of fisheries and marine protected areas, mainly in Latin America, but I could imagine it would be as relevant for other regions. Peter, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, yes, if I may. Actually, I'm just coming out of, I'm in Paris right now. We have the IOC Assembly coming up starting day after tomorrow. Just coming out of a meeting of the regional subsidiary bodies of IOC, who have a pre-meeting and trying to share experiences across from one region to the next. We have the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, the Western Pacific, and also looking at regions where we don't have subsidiary bodies within the IOC. And this came up again. How can we learn from each other? Of course, the small islands in the Pacific are quite different from the big nations in the Western Pacific. But I think there are lessons to be learned across from one region to the next. There are challenges. I talked to several Pacific islands in New York about the fact that you have very few people in each island state, who have to also be updated. They have to be trained, but they have to be updated and be part of a community where you get this continuous learning. So while, I mean, you are running a course right now, but I think the need for people to be in the network when they finish the course, to be involved and get updates, is also a thing that we need to bring back to the universities and to the educators and so forth. But these possibilities for this are increasing very rapidly now with technology. So I think if we look at capacity development 10 years ago and the possibilities today, it's a world apart. And getting networking, getting access to information and sharing of experience is just a matter of ingenuity and creativity, how we can get this forward. I'm very optimistic actually on this front.
Well, maybe I can fill in with a question that leads on from this and pass over to Martin. Chanel Rampatap says hi from South Africa. Indonesia and soon Peru are making their VMS data, which I presume is voluntary monitoring system, but I don't know, public by law. How can we incentivize other countries to follow suit?
I think, Channel, that is really an excellent question. So VMS means vessel monitoring system. And in some countries that is required, that goes beyond the AIS system that I was referring to. That's the automatic identification system for all commercial vessels. But VMS is more important because if you're in some countries like Indonesia and they are required to have a vessel monitoring system on board if they want to engage in legal fishing. And what they are doing in terms of transparency is making that VMS data available publicly. In many nations, that is a requirement, but only the authorities have access to that data. And there is the concern that maybe not full transparency is always guaranteed. There could be ways in which you go around that. Also, some nations, and I believe that's Indonesia and soon Peru, they say if a foreign nation wants to come into their economic zone and use the fishing rights to fish some part of their stock, they again are required to have their vessels monitored by the VMS system. And I think what we would very much encourage that all countries open up their VMS data sets because it's a more powerful data set than the AIS system. And I think we feel that nations who find out that good experiences are made by making them publicly available, it helps them with enforcement. And enforcement shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. We're not trying to chase people sort of away. It's really a positive thing by saying you're abiding to the contract. Many coastal states have contract with commercial fisheries organization where they agree on a small amount of the stock to be fished, hopefully according to sustainability laws. And if that is an open contract, well negotiated, done well, then I think it can actually help us to increase global food security by do the right type of fishing. And to ensure that the right type of fishing get done, that people adhere to the quota, a vessel monitoring system should be part of it. Now, how can we turn the tide there? I mean, I would say most of the fish gets sold to either the North American market, to Japan and Europe. And if those three regions would basically agree and say we're only going to import from regions where, first of all, the fishing is done sustainably, according to maximum sustainable yield quota, you'll get that in a few weeks, but also where the coastal state has proper tracking of the behavior of the other nations. So we only want to import fish to Norway, to Germany, to France, to the US, if you can track, first of all, the fish, and it's done with full transparency, including with vessels which report their VMS data, I think we can very quickly turn the tide on this and to create it in a more open, well-regulated, and yet commercially quite interesting market. I think what we have to get out of is the uneducated consumers, like I used to be. You go to the fish store and buy the fish that looks great. You have no idea where it comes from. You have no idea that a lot of illegal efforts are going on. You have no idea that sometimes the worker laws are terrible. It's almost slavery at sea. All of these things can be avoided by making things more transparent. And we're working very much in the academic community, with the NGO community, and with these regional setups to really encourage full transparency in fishing and fish marketing. And we would definitely like the more richer countries to really abide to that transparency law and to really only import and sell fish which is sustainably caught and where we know the whole value chain and the money flow. I think that can be done, and making your vessel monitoring system freely open should be maybe even a prerequisite for some of these labels that we have for sustainable fishing.
Could I add quickly a little bit to that? Because I think this is a splendid example of where it's not only a question of government's regulation, it's also a question of industry and consumers, and where you can put the demands out there, and then you have some governments who do the right thing and who set an example, and then more will need to follow because of the pressure from consumers and industries. And I think, again, it's partly technology enabled, and it's a splendid example of of how we need to engage all sectors of society, not only the governments who negotiate the laws, and we not only need to police the fish vessels who do the illegal, unreported fishing. We can actually start from the consumer side, and then we can solve the problem in perhaps a more elegant way. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Peter, a little bit in more detail. The IOC really does deal with data and scientific knowledge and generating it, but also sharing it where it makes the most impact. Would data of this kind, which are used for regulation or even enforcement, fall into this mandate? And if so, do you see in some maybe future vision that this would be something which countries would share on a more open and global and transparent form?
Well, direct fisheries, that data are on the realm of FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. So the IOC deals more with, say, environmental data of the state of the ocean, but also ecosystems and so on. But I mean, that's also one of the things we do here. We work together across the UN system with other specialized agencies, and what we see is that the sector management of the ocean is not always sufficient. We need to link these things together. Even if, as you stay within the fisheries management, there are other things with the environment in which this fishing goes on, which need to be shared. So I think by working with other organizations, we can do that. We wouldn't do it inside the IOC alone.
Wonderful. We have several more questions. Let me change tack a little bit. And Joe asks, how to get from science to decision making is maybe the hottest topic at this time. I would love examples from Martin. Could you summarize the key tools, how the communication tools from science work?
Wonderful question. Thank you for that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in many parts of the world, we have a lot of scientific knowledge. And sometimes the scientists or the knowledge community, or including the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, are a little bit frustrated that the knowledge that we have isn't readily taken up in the lawmaking. And I think that frustration comes from two sides. On the one hand, the academic community, and I'm certainly part of that, we feel we're working in universities, we look at problems, we analyze problems, we think about solutions, we think, wouldn't such and such be a great idea? And then we write down what the solution is, we take that knowledge to the policymakers and put it on the desk and say, that's what you have to do. Now, a policymaker operates quite differently. They are responsible for many, many constituencies, and science is just one of the many of them. They're quite often more responsible for taking care of their national development problems, national security, maybe jobs and growth in a country, or they're trying to manage industry in a productive way. And sometimes they say, well, we just dealt with such a topic last year, and we don't want to touch it for the next 5 years. And what we've learned is that if you really want to have influence in decision-making in policies in the business world, it is much smarter to talk to all the actors ahead of time and say, for example, here's an issue around land grabbing, let's say sand mining, just to give one example. And the scientists feel that's probably a concern. Is that also a concern from you policymaker in a coastal state? And they might tell you, I never heard about it, I don't know what it is, tell me more about it. They might say, yep, we know all about it, it's very difficult, big companies are involved, we need to take care of our income of our coastal state, we're trying to manage it well. They say, well, this is not a good time, come back in 3 years. But all this is useful information. But quite often when you do this negotiation right, you can convene, even sometimes scientists can start this convening, but also governments can, or industry. But what we found is what the most helpful discussion is, you convene a multi-stakeholder forum where all those people, civil society, business, government, sciences, and others, maybe indigenous knowledge, get together, and you put an issue in the front, let's say grabbing of sand, and you basically just put out your concern or your idea, and then you just hear out what the others have to say. If you do that, then maybe your initial idea of what would be really cool and the best solution of all turns out to be impossible. But in the dialogue, sometimes you find a solution which is maybe not the best, but not bad, second best. Everybody likes it a lot. And I would always encourage us to go for the second best solution, which people want to implement, than developing the best solution that for some reason can't be implemented. So I think we've learned that by engaging in a multi-stakeholder fashion around certain issues, usually in the region, you can actually bridge that divide between the knowledge community and the decision community elegantly. Let me give you a number of examples where that has worked really well. For example, when you think about the climate arena, I mean, 50 years ago, governments were not even sure that climate change was real, was something that they should do something about, or was a real problem. I think we came way past that. Now most governments around the globe at least acknowledge that climate change is real, that it's going to have adverse effect on the environment, and they have to do something about it. On the other hand, what to do about it is very different. In some countries, they are really trying to change the energy system in a very radical way. In other countries, they feel they should just be more efficient in how they use energy. In other countries, they're very concerned about that because it's been a loss of a market. If you're a country who sells coal or oil and gas, you don't like any restrictions on that. So you're very much about what are you going to do with your people if nobody wants to buy your coal, which is giving all of your input in economic terms to your society. And in other countries, they're developing technology that they want to sell on the global market that really allows people to be more energy efficient. So you can see it's not a one-size-fits-all, but when you have a debate around nations, around regions, and in a multi-stakeholder form, you can make progress. Now, individually, I would say many of the solutions have to do with personal choice. Is, you know, are you going to say, I wish I could have every vacation on a Hawaii island and you fly half the globe around from Europe, or you say, oh, I'd love to see Hawaii once in my lifetime, but I'm really only going to do it once, and the rest of my vacations I'm going to be cycling in my coastline. I mean, these are, that's your choice, and you can work with your community to really think about is what is it desirable? Is it really desirable to live a life of somebody who has unbound resources? Or are there other ways that can be also quite desirable, that have a more defensible economic footprint? Or you say, like my daughter, she's big into volunteering. She will be joining a foundation to protect marine life, sea turtles. And she just feels she wants to devote some of her energy and effort to protect marine species. So I think, you know, it can be little, it can be large, but these things do scale up when you discuss it in your community, when you think about community activities around ocean or conservation, and then all of a sudden what starts at a very small scale bubbles up into the, at least say, civil society desires, and these things do bubble up into the policy domain, because if the politicians hear from many parts of society, we really need to do something about climate or fishing or sand grabbing, then they're more interested to engage in these multi-stakeholder dialogues and say, yeah, I guess we have to do something about it. It's kind of expensive, but I guess everybody wants to see it happen, so I'm going to work with you and look for a solution. So I think awareness raising is a good part of it. Engagement is another part of it. As Peter said, regions are really the key for implementation. But I will say the New York conference, SDG 14, gives us a lot of political capital. It allows you to go to your policymakers and say, have you heard about goal 14 in the SDGs? You know, it says we must do something, and here's a solution, I want to talk to you. And that open door is what conferences like New York do for you, but I think the action has to come in the regions or from the ground up.
Let me continue along that line and switch to Peter, taking a question that came up within the course in the forum, referring to the IOC and the decade proposal that will be submitted later this year, in which several activities are planned to prepare the International Decade for Ocean Science. Could you give us some examples? What kind of activities would the IOC be pushing forward? And perhaps, if relevant, what could viewers of this MOOC do to look and work in that direction?
Thank you for that question. First, maybe as a lead-in from the previous question, when for scientists, and I've been a scientist for many years and involved in ocean and climate-related issues, I think one of the lessons I've had over the years is to not anymore talk about science-based policies, but talk about science-informed policies. And the differences maybe seem subtle, but I think if you talk about science-based policies, then you have the sort of the presumption that science speaks the truth and then policy has to follow automatically. That doesn't leave space for politics and policy, and there should be a big space for political sort of you know, priorities, and there are different goals up against each other, etc. So you have to recognize that. But what is very good if you have science-informed policies, so that we share information and everybody has the same sort of basic agreed information to start with. That will help the debate and help the development. So what we are doing now, on Wednesday, we have a panel debate here at the IOC Assembly, where we have invited some bodies and actors outside the IOC to come and join us and give us their perspective on the panel. This is the World Meteorological Organization. This is the International Hydrographic Organization in Monaco, which deals with seabed mapping, etc. It is actually UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and we have several others. We have also from the UN in New York. So we will have their view. What is their recommendation? How do they think the priorities should be? We have already also communicated with some regional bodies status of this proposal and see if they want to join us. So what is the next step is we have the UNESCO General Conference here in fall, in November, and we have the United Nations General Assembly in fall, where the resolution, hopefully from the IOC Assembly, will be brought forward. And there is a possibility then, if the UN General Assembly so wishes, to formally declare that we will have such a decade. So until we are there, we're kind of in the sort of preparation mode. And so we take that 2018 will be the time when we have to learn from the experience. I think also from the Ocean Conference 10 days ago, the way it was run with the major stakeholders involved at the table. It was, yes, it was the governments negotiating the call for action and so forth, but throughout there were major stakeholder groups at the table in the preparatory committee and in the conference itself. So we haven't worked out exactly how we want to do that, and that's on purpose, because if we produce sort of a frame here which was kind of completely decided, then it wouldn't be a co-design. So that's where we want to go now. We want to take it starting next year, use the time in 2018 to see how we can get this process going, see what the priorities are, see what the goals should be, what are the realistic things, and then a process perhaps somewhat like a call for action to do the different parts. I would say some initiatives are already emerging, like seabed mapping. We have a very poor knowledge of the seafloor, both in terms of mapping the seafloor depth, which is actually important not only for navigation but also for science and for many other purposes. When it comes to the biology on the seafloor, it's even worse. So we need to have some activity devoted to that. Then there are the societally beneficial possibilities for more improved seasonal forecasting, which depends on ocean observations. That is emerging, and then there are all the things with how do we deal with pollution and harvesting from the ocean. So I don't think I would like to say very much more on the specific priorities at this point in time. This is part of the point that we will develop this over the year or next year to come.
Avan, if I may add to that, I think one of the exciting possibilities for ocean science would be, once it's agreed upon, and I think Peter is exactly telling me what I think is a very sensible strategy. There's a bit of a political UN type of process we have to go through for the next 18 months or so. But once that's agreed, that we will have that decade for ocean science, I think I'm very convinced that just like we had 10 days ago at the UN conference, there will be a call for engagement. There will be a website where everybody can go in and register what it is that you want to bring to the decade of ocean science. And these could be, I'm going to run this MOOC in my university for the next 10 years and make it part of the core curriculum. It could be, I'm going to set up a civil society group that works very hard on ocean literacy for the next 10 years. So everybody in my community at least knows the 10 most exciting ocean solutions and maybe is aware of the 5 most concerning issues around ocean. You might say, I'm going to, start up an international academy or learning group or group of friends to share our knowledge. We're going to compare what's happening in South Africa with what's happening in Peru, with China and Mauritius, and we really want to learn from each other so we can do maybe an aquaculture activity more sustainable. So I'm expecting that frame for the decade of ocean science will be very open, and just as the diplomats are preparing to get the legal frame sorted out, I think there will be an engagement frame is supported by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission that is going to be open for all of us. And I think that's, at least from what I read in the document and heard in the side event, to me, what makes this very exciting. It's not a predetermined format, this is what has to be done and you're going to have to do it. But I think it's a frame where we can collectively showcase, put our best foot forward and see what everybody else is doing. And by that, feel like we're part of a global movement, we're part of a global community that, uses science towards certainly societal goals and really build up a more engaged, more networked and more solution-oriented science community. To me, that is the most exciting aspect of that decade. And I really hope that our member states will agree to put this forward. And if you happen to know somebody in your government that is well versed in UN affairs, you can talk to them and say, I heard about this decade of ocean science in wherever, in the MOOC, or I read about it. I'm very excited about it. It suits me very well. Can you put in a good word for it? I think these voices from the ground sometimes do make a difference when the diplomats decide on issues like that.
This is something that has been coming up repeatedly. In fact, the most common sentiment in our forums is exactly what you've both been saying right now about what can we do. And I take it, Martin, as an open invitation for everybody who's watching to make a commitment, no matter how individual or in which form or organization they would like to go. And I think that's something that has been asked a lot. We have Merle Ucker asking, it's such a tragedy that there's no common regulation for the use of most of the oceans. It also puzzled me that the people who are supposed to administer the sea have economic interest. And this is something that really has to do with political will, about how much people have an influence in what is going on. Would somebody like to pick that up?
Well, maybe I can say a few words. We have the law of the sea, which gives coastal states certain rights. We have the exclusive economic zones. We have the extension of the continental shelf, and those processes with the law of the sea was a big and long negotiation that was brought to a successful completion, and a lot of work has happened later on sort of delineating the continental shelves, etc. But we have a big areas outside the national jurisdiction. And one of the things that have impressed me, but hasn't yet been completed, but was that United Nations General Assembly some couple of years ago decided that they would actually create, and this is a complicated wording, a legally binding instrument for biological diversities in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now, what that means is these areas where we don't have the full rights of the coastal state, there is resources out there, probably unknown resources, biological diversity. And we would like to create some laws, some regulation for that as well. That's a major undertaking. And you might have thought that this was too complicated. The governments didn't want to touch it. We just leave it. It's a difficult area because we have different principles, freedom of the high seas. We'd like to go there. Scientists would like to do research without being stopped. There's many interests, but they do this. And it's not yet clear, but the process has been going on for a couple of years to decide whether this extension of the law of the sea will actually take place. It may actually be decided in fall already at the next United Nations General Assembly. It will probably be a long process before that has been finished, but I think it's promising. And what's promising, again, from my point of view, is that some of the things we are doing in collecting information, we have something we call Ocean Biogeographic Information System, which is a data repository that we run at the IOC, coming out of a project called Census of Marine Life that took place some years ago. At least more and more governments see that, in order to make a sensible arrangements for these big areas of the world ocean, we need to take this kind of scientific information into account, and we need to share it. And we are working also with the International Seabed Authority to present jointly with them and with other intergovernmental processes how we think that if such an instrument is put in place, it should work with the basic information. So no, the ocean is big. There's many interests. It's a lot of political processes which are difficult, but at least I see a willingness across the world to work with the basic information and data, which I think wasn't there some years ago. And I'm actually quite optimistic, not underestimating the complexities of these kind of processes.
And I think this goes very well into a comment that Eugene Bornen just posted, which picks up on this and says corruption is the biggest hurdle to progress. So let's take what you've said as an optimistic view of how one might even get around to solving that problem. Martin, you had another?
Yes, I'd like to speak to both of those issues because, and I think Peter very elegantly outlined some of the frontiers of where international law and UN law is trying to get organized. But this was a specific question to the role of youth. And at the UN, I think we're seeing more and more, it used to be run solely by diplomats. So these are government officials, and diplomats have a certain way of doing business, which is logic to them and hard to penetrate and understandable for Peter and I and maybe other scientists. But increasingly also at the UN level, they're involving more and more what they call the major stakeholder groups. That's again UN speak, but what that really means is, for example, one major stakeholder group is science. So science is asked to comment on these processes. Science has an ability to speak up at negotiations and talk to the lawyers and or the representative of all the states and say what science feels. But the UN has others. There's UN Women that talks about the rights for women, but there's also UN Youth. And I will say, watching the UN operate over the last 5 years, I've seen that the UN Youth Group has been very effective. They have been organizing themselves very well. For example, at the Oceans Conference, every morning the young people would get together in the cafe and decide who's going to go to which breakout group. And very often in the breakout groups, they raise their hand and say, have you been thinking about the next generation? This sounds all technical. This sounds like you want to rake the maximum benefit for you this year, or you are promoting intransparent behavior. So I think the next generation is more and more heard at the UN. And Ban Ki-moon, during his tenure, he was the last Secretary General. And when we negotiate the SDG 14 and the whole Agenda 2030, he basically said, at this point in time, more than half of the world's population is younger than 24. So it's really the youth who should be running the decision making, because it's your future that is at stake and not our future who are mostly here in front of the screen. So I would encourage you to engage, to hook up with your colleagues and make your voice heard. The UN is definitely open for input for the next generation. And it's again a matter of ganging up, getting together. The SDSN has the SDN Youth Group, which I can highly encourage you to get engaged with. I believe the IOC is thinking about setting up a young forum. Many national groups have increasing number of youth fora to make the voice heard. And I think you should not despair. In fact, you can definitely change behavior and call out for transparency and call out sort of intransparent behavior by being a stakeholder. So I think the times are good, and the UN is definitely more and more open for these major groups, including the young people.
That's wonderful, because two questions just came in on just that. So Thomas Chardon and Anne Jo ask about the role of social media as an efficient tool to get the public's attention, looking at Chris Hadfield and the space question, and couldn't it be useful to get decision makers to focus on the ocean? Anne Jo asks, what future channels for knowledge sharing and community resilience could be?
Peter, you start.
Yeah. I'm an amateur in tweeting. I do that, but I mean, we're learning. Even the older generation is learning, and I think this is also quite something that leaves me optimistic, because you know, as long as we can keep, and that is actually quite important, we need to keep the internet, you know, open. And you know, we have a big debate in my home country, Norway, about the journalism, about the fact that we have the newspapers closed down and so forth, and we don't have sufficient, maybe free. We have free press still in Norway, but we need to keep those values alive. But I think what is we shouldn't underestimate the need to ensure that the internet is freely available to everyone, and that there are things happening there which most of us aren't aware of. Decisions have to be made and so forth to make sure that that channel is freely available. But I think everybody has the possibility to have their voice heard, as long as you are sort of conscious yourself about what information you are giving where, and who is your partner, and so forth. I think we just have to see, and again, I think the youth and their ingenuity and the creativity, there may be solutions out there which in 2 years which we don't even think about today. And look at all the things we are using today we didn't use some years ago. So keep and ways in which to sort of also check. This is changing the scientific information as well. The peer review processes are becoming different than they used to be. The fact that we have open source journals, how do we fund them, and so forth. So many challenges, but so many opportunities that I think we just have to see who comes up with the most creative way of communicating and spreading the word.
And if I can add, Avan, I also, like Peter, you know, I dabble in social media. We're no pros nor experts on this, but I think we're trying to learn and see how it works well. I mean, if you look at our number of followers, we're nowhere near rock stars or pop stars or movie stars. So the UN has learned to engage those for messaging, and we saw, you know, Princess Victoria from Sweden come to the UN conference last week, and I can tell you, the German tabloid was reporting about the dress that she wore at the Oceans Conference. I mean, that was, I guess, the only way that they would ever talk about the Ocean Conference in a tabloid. And I think maybe some people thought, oh, how cool is that? Princess Victoria goes to an ocean conference. I think that's cool. But personally, on the solution side, I heard a great story last year from one of those areas. So it's called a UNESCO program on Marine World Heritage Site. And there's a reef in Yemen that is technically protected. But Yemen is a bit of a failed state right now, which some of you might know. And that colleague he lives in the island of Socotra. He's in charge of that protected reef. He's the park ranger. And he saw big bulldozers showing up in front of the park, and he got very concerned. And then he talked to them, and they said, yeah, we're from building company so-and-so. We're gonna, build a big hotel in the middle of the reef. And he's like, you can't do that. We're protected status from the World Heritage Site in UNESCO. And they said, look at my paper here. We have all the stamps from the government. We're okay. So he thought, whoa, what can I do? He tried to call his minister, and he was like, yeah, I know, don't worry, it'll be fine. And then he got a little WhatsApp group together in Socotra, and within 3 days, he mobilized 400 or 500 young people who did a blockade around the bulldozers. And that little news journalism that was there, it was all televised. And in 2 days, the permit was revoked, because it was an illegal permit, certainly bought by intransparent methods, and that minister really didn't want to be seen on television in front of protesting youth to do something illegal. So it just shows you sometimes social media can be really helpful in bringing out bad behavior and in changing the way decisions goes. So I think I found this a very encouraging story from a part of the world that you would never ever expected that. So I would say definitely use your ingenuity, use your social media skills, your networking tools to make your voice heard. And you will find out that governments, politicians, they like to do the right things, and you can call them out on that, and quite often you can actually sway their opinion.
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful example. Power to the people and ground roots democracy. That's what social media is capable of mobilizing. We're coming into the last few minutes, and I've saved one of the most common questions within the MOOC forum for the last, because I think it's a bit thoughtful. I don't want to ignore the last question from Thomas Büdel, who wonders whether the awareness on the ocean will lead to more jobs in oceanography. So maybe if I'd just say, Thomas, I certainly hope so. And for the good of the ocean. But let me go to my last question to both of you. And there have been many people in the forum who've said, well, the ocean providing economic benefits, providing ecosystem values is one aspect. But what about the inherent value of the beauty of the ocean, or the ethical, or even, well, maybe the ethical obligation that humankind has to protect other parts of nature? And I know that many of our people have spoken about it, but how do you think this actually fits into the equation? Peter, if you would go.
Yeah. That's a big question. It's an interesting one. I mean, the ethical value, you can say, also linking to the discussions we've had about climate, is, are we here to make the best solution for people, or does nature itself have a separate value? That's one of the questions you can come up with. And I remember some years ago, actually UNESCO, they have a committee on ethics, and they looked at the ethics of climate change, and they tried to have consultations around the world about, what is the possibility for a declaration of climate change based on ethical principles. And one of the most interesting findings they come up with for me was that, well, even if different cultures, religions, and so forth have different principles and different attitudes precisely to this about the standalone value of nature, for example, it's still possible to derive perhaps rules for how to behave, even if you have different basic foundation for your theory. And that gave me also some optimism that whether or not we assign a standalone value to organisms or natural reserves and so forth, or whether we think about humans as being the main sort of beneficiary and the one we need to think about, the best solutions may be the same, because we depend on the ocean. We depend on a well-functioning ocean for many things. Then there are also, of course, things that we may not know, resources, genetic resources and so on, that we don't really know, and that's a reason itself for protecting the ocean from destruction. But I think let's come together. Let's think about where are you coming from, different groups. What are your principles, and see what actions can you derive from those, and let's maybe discuss the actions rather than trying to convince people to change their religion or change their basic culture. And I think there are possibilities for ending up with the right actions, even if people have different starting points as the basic foundation. That's a start, maybe.
Martin, would you like to have some closing words before we shut down?
Yes, very wise words from Peter. I think very well put. And I came across this when you look at some of the documents, also from last week's conference. Quite often it talks about we need to save the ocean, we need to take care of the ocean. It's sort of all as if we're in power of the ocean. It all depends on us. It's a very human-centric view. And when you go to Asia, they talk more about living in harmony with the ocean. So I think sometimes they have the balance between humanity and nature a little better or a little righter. But I agree with Peter, whatever worldview you come from, think a little bit deeper about what is a productive human-ocean interaction, and also be mindful of that most of us enjoy the ocean because you like to go there and just stare over the ocean. And have you ever thought about that, why that's interesting? It's just a bit of water sloshing back and forth, sometimes even smelly, but most of us are really excited in doing it. So I think it has some deep moral questions about us in the relationship to the ocean, the the rights for the animals in the ocean versus everything is about me or the human race. So I think these are very good thoughts to have when you think with your friends or in the MOOC about the ocean. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit in the MOOC, about the morality of it. But I agree with Peter, let's not put the moral sort of pointing finger too much up in the air, but let's really think about sustainable interaction with the ocean. And quite often you come to the same good actions which have great outcomes for you and for the next generation and for the ecosystem that supports our lifestyle. I think that's a very well frame to think about that.
Well, thank you, both of you. I'll just end by reading out what Eugene Borman posted. He says, "Thank you, Peter and Martin. With your enthusiasm, we might just change the world." Thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. People can change the world. That's a good ending note.
I like